So thank you all. This is a great group. We've got faculty, friends, staff, students, administrators. It's terrific. We are going to have a fun morning talking about innovation in higher education. We are even going to, each one of us, get to work in a team and reinvent the university. That'll be fun. So this event is hosted by Project XITE, DU's cross-disciplinary platform that engages our community in issues around innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship, led by the deans of engineering, law, and business. So thank you, Dean Katz, X-ITE, and Holston. I also want to recognize Eric Matisek. Eric, raise your hand, because some people may not know you. He's the new executive director of Project XITE. So the feature today is Randy Bass and George Kembel, and I'm so excited that they can both join us. I'm going to introduce them in just a second, but just to point out, they really represent the kind of incredible innovation from within higher education that's going on each coast, and here it's now meeting kind of in the middle, in the Rocky Mountains. Randy's work in Georgetown has provided some pathways for really agile innovation, especially but not only in the liberal education. I've known Randy, I think, for about 15 years since we were both working at the Carnegie together, and very steadily he's explored the frontiers of liberal education and of higher education while maintaining that strength and substance. George Kembel is one of the co-founders of the D.school at Stanford, and now its global director, taking that approach around the world. He's been at the cutting edge, kind of coming in from the outside into education, not only looking at classical approaches, but really new, innovative ways, not only of teaching and learning, but of making, creating, doing. So Randy and George this morning will each speak to the group, after which Randy's going to curate, with George's help, a design effort where each table will be asked to create the University of Tomorrow from scratch, today, in an hour over lunch. Does it? I mean, that's my thing, right? That sounds like fun. We're going to have a good time. So today's session really comes in a context of the acceleration of change in our world, and these changes have disrupted industries of all sorts. I see Trig Marin, he can tell you about what it's done to media and publishing. More recently, we've seen it in the hotel industry with Airnub, just transforming, disrupting how we think of the traditional hotel and hospitality industry. We're seeing it in the auto industry. Everyone's using Uber and Lyft. They're now thinking, those in the auto industry, that they don't do cars, they do transit. Real different framework. Some of you got to come to the Project XITE convening on cybersecurity, an industry which didn't even exist a decade ago, and now is becoming one, if not the most, critical economic force in our time. So in this context of a lot of change in the world, some say that higher ed will be the last institution, maybe joined by the federal government, to be disrupted. Some argue that it's just never going to be disrupted, it's just going to fail away. That is to say, some argue that higher education is already beyond a pivot point. Randy and George's work and success show us that this isn't true. Higher ed is definitely not beyond a pivot point, at least not at Georgetown and Stanford, and now all the way around the world. So we're going to welcome their stories and insights today as we think about these issues at DU. Because I think in many ways, DU Impact 2025, our strategic plan, joins the work of Randy and George in really building upon traditions and strengths, but also innovating, or to use a phrase from Randy, reinventing the university from within. So we're looking at lots of things at DU. We're looking at the fact that we're educating students who will go out and change their careers 7 to 14 times, no matter what their discipline. We're looking at how to deliver teaching and learning. Yes, the traditional ways stay, but there are radical new ways, and for us, so much of it's around problem-centered learning and taking students out into the world in internships, in workshops, in project-based learning, in co-op programs. But it's also research that is involving project-based, design thinking, infused, experiential, diverse, team-led, more and more. That's what we're seeing our faculty do. That's what we're seeing our students desire. That's what we're seeing nonprofits and employers want. That's what the public good is needing. You know, as I think about how we're kind of reinventing the university from within, I think about how our space has changed. So I think it's kind of interesting, and some of you may not have been to the Anderson Academic Commons, but last night a group of deans were discussing this about Anderson Academic Commons. So this was once the library, right? Stacks and stacks, big, beautiful boxes of books where people came in and quietly studied. No food allowed. And now you go into Anderson Academic Commons and you see it. Students hovering, students talking to one another, students working together on their projects, all sorts of different types of seating. You have to go down into the bowels of the building to even find classical books. And the first thing you see, a coffee shop, one of the favorite spots on campus. I couldn't have imagined that when I started college. And now it's about the most favorite gathering space on campus. So we're asked to be creative, to discover, to inquire, to be rigorous, to experiment in old ways and new. So now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce the speakers. And I'm going to introduce both of them. I'll introduce George, who will be speaking first, and then I'll introduce Randy. George is an entrepreneur and investor turned educated. He co-founded the D.school at Stanford and now leads its global effort as its global director. He lives in Boulder, but really he lives all the way around the world. We're lucky to catch him. Passionate about nurturing the creative potential of others, George spends his time working with students, teachers, leaders, and investors to unlock the latent innovative capacity of their teams and organizations. Under George's leadership, the D.school has grown from a few projects and a classroom of students to hundreds of projects, thousands of students, and a cutting-edge 30,000 square foot facility at the center of campus. George has scaled the D.school's impact even more dramatically. From a napkin manifesto to a widely recognized leader in innovation and education, the D.school has helped usher in a larger global design thinking movement. Schools and universities around the world are starting D.school-like programs. And the startup companies and projects that have spun out of the D.school have already impacted the lives of millions. Can't wait to hear your stories and insights. Our first speaker is Randy Bass. Randy is Vice Provost for Education and Professor of English at Georgetown University, where he leads the Designing the Futures initiative and the Red House Incubator for curriculum transformation. Recently, we sent a team to Georgetown, and they all came home and wanted their own Red House. For 13 years, he was a founding executive director of Georgetown's Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, usually called CANDLES. Randy has been working at the intersections of new media technologies in the scholarship of learning and teaching for 20 years, including serving as director and principal investigator of the Visible Knowledge Project, a 5-year scholarship of teaching and learning project involving 70 faculty on 21 university and college campuses. From 2003 to 2009, he was a consulting scholar for the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, where he served in 1998 to 99 as a Pew Scholar and Carnegie Fellow. In 1999, he won the EDUCAUSE Medal for Outstanding Achievement in Technology in Undergraduate Education. Bass is the author and editor of numerous books, articles, and electronic projects, including Border Text, Cultural Readings for Contemporary Writers. Randy and George, thank you both. Randy, you're up first.
I was told I had to stay behind the mic, and I already have failed to do that, so I'm back. So it is really wonderful to be here and to be part of this event, and thank you very much, Rebecca. It's fantastic to be here, and it's wonderful to be here with George, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the morning. So I am going to, yes, hope everybody can see the slides. I would like to first say a little bit about the context where I work, then kind of give one version of a vision of where we might be going, put it in the context of how I see the larger landscape of higher education, try to give you a few examples of things we're doing at Georgetown, and then bring it to a close. So I kept trying to pare things down. I hope it's, so I'm going to talk really fast, but I'll leave my slides and we'll have lots of time for conversation. So I spend most of my time running this project, as Rebecca said, called Designing the Futures of the University. I have other sort of day job-like things as Vice Provost for Education. But the Designing the Futures project was created 3 years ago as a way to, by our Provost and our President, to accelerate change. And it was kind of in the middle of sort of the MOOC moment and, you know, a lot of talk about disruption, et cetera. And we had done made a bunch of investments in technology, enhanced learning, and other kinds of pedagogical sorts of things. But there was this sense in which merely working at the level of pedagogical innovation or at the level of course-based innovation was not enough. That what we really needed to do was to be asking, what should a Georgetown education look like 5, 10, or 15 years from now? And that the only way that we could really be in full control of how we can respond to the external environment is to be reinventing ourselves. So that's when we created the Futures Project, and shortly after we started, we moved into this townhouse, which I hadn't even noticed was red until the president came 3 months into our work, and we were telling him what we were doing, and then everywhere he went, he said, "Let me tell you what I saw at the Red House." I thought, oh, the Red House, that's catchy. So that's where we do a lot of our work, and it's literally right across the street from the university, and it's this tiny little townhouse. But it's the space where faculty teams come in and they try to imagine, and we help them imagine projects that have to do at least 3 things in addition to, you know, doing something beneficial pedagogically or in terms of student learning. They have to break at least one rule. Right? So they have to somehow push on at least one of our constraints, help us redefine what a course is, how we count credits, what progress to degree looks like, what the academic calendar looks like, how we count faculty load, how we measure learning. Right? It has to push it. If it's merely a good idea, merely a pedagogical enhancement, then they go over to the Center for Teaching and they can get lots of help there. And that's great. But we're trying to do something else. We're trying to create small, game-changing projects that help us rethink the boundaries and the structures within which we work. The other 2 things that they have to do is, one, that they have to have a sustainable cost model. So even if I fund it as a pilot outside the business model, the economics of the model has to look sustainable. It can't just be an expensive new good idea that pushes a boundary. And it has to be portable. It has to be a model that other people could take up. It can't just be something quirky that this unique combination of faculty. So that's what we've been trying to do and push in this system. So I'll come back at the end to talk about some of the things, but here are some of our assumptions. We're merely trying to ask the question, how can we ensure quality student learning and improve faculty professional lives? Right? Over the last 3 years, I've had all kinds of much more highfalutin sentences of what we're trying to do. But I found, gee, just tell faculty you're trying to make their lives better. That's a really good opening line. But in light of at least 2 huge challenges. One is the changing context of higher education. I have liberal here, but all of higher education. Globalization, technology, diversity. Right? The context of what it means to be educating has just changed incredibly. And then the unsustainable rising costs of higher education and the question of equity. What is the role of higher education in creating, in reducing the inequalities in our society? And to what extent are our institutions of higher education closing them or perpetuating them? And we operate on the assumption that there's at least 2 things that we have to do to be what I'll just call simply our best selves to do those other things. One is we have to be much more flexible and nimble institutions than we are. And two, we have to be much more connected and integrated. And so every project has something to do with agility and flexibility and something to do with making connections across the campus of units that have otherwise been poorly connected. And our belief, and I'll come back to this later, is that this wasn't about a grand plan. It wasn't about creating a huge Thomas More-like utopia on the edge of campus and see if it worked. It was about trying to foster small, game-changing projects that could be put into the system right now, and that themselves would basically create, as Stephen Johnson, who wrote well, he writes a book a year, but wrote the book, How Good Ideas, but I can't remember the title now. Where Good Ideas Come From, thank you. Is you just got to put more parts on the table. You try to create the conditions of what the biologist Stuart Kauffman called the adjacent possible. And that's what we're trying to do. Just put things into the system that change what looks viable. But out in front of us is always this question, and this is a version of the question that we'll have you working on later in the morning. If we were designing higher education right now, what would it look like? And I'll just put all these up at once, What do we really deeply value about what we do? This isn't about no longer valuing faculty and students sitting around a seminar table studying texts. It's just about what are the new contexts for what inquiry is. What are the new contexts for mentoring? But what do we value? What do we know about what we value? What do we know about how learning happens? What do we know about this incredible new digital ecosystem that we all swim in and live in every day? What do we know about our students and the changing demographics? And what do we know about what our students, they're not just going to have to change careers 7 to 14 times, which is of course true. They're going to have to deal with some of the most complex, wickedest problems ever. So if we were designing with all that in mind and more, what would it look like? So I get to actually ask that question of undergraduates every year. I've been co-teaching a course called The Future of the University as a Design Problem for 4 years. I co-teach it with this brilliant architect named Ann Pendleton Julian. And we have students, undergraduates, what they do is they work on projects where they try to imagine the Georgetown of 2030. And we tell them that they're designing for context, not content. They're asking, what do we think the conditions of knowledge, learning, technology, work will be in 15 years? And then what kind of graduate do we want to produce? It's what Anne would call, and what Steven Spielberg would call, world building, right? They now make movies where, like Minority Report, first one ever, you build the world, then you write the script. So here's one of those students' projects, and I wanted to share it with you. It's a project called the Yugi, I-U-G-I. 3 students, Nauman, Delbert, and Essie. Essie was a pre-med classics major, so she was the one that brought in Yugi, which is Latin for team, or actually the thing that yokes the team of oxen together, but it also is related to the word play, so it's a wonderful pun. So they tried to imagine what would a Yugi-centric university look like. Here was their opening premise. What if Georgetown could promote knowledge synthesis through collaborative projects from day one to graduation, involving students, professors, staff, and practitioners? Okay, that was their premise. They have all these different system features. I'm only going to show you like 3 slides. First, what a Yugi is. Then they had this wonderful unlocking mechanism that you performed at a certain level in a Yugi, and that unlocked the next level of Yugi for you. It was very much a video game metaphor. Like you then got unlocked into the next level of Yugi. And other things you can see. So for them, Yugis are project families that reverse the course-centric learning model. So this is their version of today. Remember, this is just a spare design project, and they actually have very lovely designs. That's their drawing of today. Class, lab. And this is their drawing of tomorrow. So the Yugi is in the center, and then surrounding it is what they charmingly call knowledge packets. What we might call knowledge, but the students in this class always are very amusing how they perceive things that we consider quite core. I remember the very first year we taught this, they were doing their first pinups, and Ann and I looked at it and we said, so are there like any faculty in this university? And one of them goes, oh yeah, no, there are faculty like around chilling. I thought, oh, that sounds pretty good. Am I getting paid for this chilling? It was only later that it occurred to me, maybe they meant like cryogenically chilling, I don't know. But, so that's what a yugi looks like. So the yugi's in the center, and they had this whole elaborate theory of how students would come in, and the first thing they would do, the most important choice that a first-year student would make is which yugi to join. And they had this whole elaborate series of color coding by discipline and competencies, etc. So that's what those triangles are. And then surrounding the yugi are things like lecture series and reading groups and online courses. But for them, they're just taking it as a given that knowledge is all around us. But the thing that is really special is a community of practice. Right, so you're in a community of practice, you're doing work on the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. on environment and health, but maybe you're in a reading cluster with an English professor reading urban literature, or you're doing something on, epidemiology of health disparities. But those are all on the margins, or on the periphery. What's in the center is the community of practice. And here's their curriculum. They said, now it's not a 4-year curriculum, it's just a 4 yugi curriculum. And it simply moves from guidance to independence and simplicity to complexity. And they have one graduation requirement. This is their exact phrase. You can graduate when you have played a non-peripheral role in a level 4 yugi. That means you're ready to go. I can't tell you how many projects of the last 4 years I've taught this course look something like this. This is where students go. They go to a place where they are engaged in real work from the very beginning. Totally acknowledging how you can be really naive and not know anything, etc. But it's in the context of real work where they want to figure out what it is they need to know to do more of that work or a different kind of work. It's this incredible yearning for connection to real stuff. Here's some of the things that these students know, both by research and intuitively. So this is a list you may have seen many times. This is the list of what the National Survey of Student Engagement, AAC&U, calls high-impact practices. Right? These are the practices that we know most highly correlate to student persistence in college, student success, and higher learning outcomes. The more of these you do, the more likely you are to graduate. And the greater the effect, the greatest effect is on high-risk populations. First-gen, low-income, underrepresented groups. That's why they're called high-impact practices. Here I have mapped those high-impact practices around my cartoon map of the curriculum. Right? So the formal curriculum is in the center. What I would call the experiential co-curriculum is around the margins. We spend most of our dollars in the middle. We spend the least of our dollars around the center. Though, if you go to the Georgetown website, I don't know about the Denver website, where we've posted all these videos that somebody may or may not ever be watching, most of them are about the margin. Our mission and brand is heavily invested in the marginal co-curriculum. So where are the high-impact practices located? Either they're anomalous in the formal curriculum, that one freshman seminar, those couple of writing intensive courses, or they're in the marginal experiential co-curriculum. What do we know about what makes high-impact practices high impact? Right? And here I'm streaming together a bunch of different research. We know it's where students want to invest their time. It's where they engage in what Lee Schulman from the president of the Carnegie Foundation used to call accountable talk. It's where they learn to give and get feedback. It's where they make daily decisions, judgments, and uncertainty. Possibly the most important thing we can teach people is how to make judgments in conditions of uncertainty, which is, I think, what they figure happens inside a yugi. They're outside their comfort zone, and they're integrating, synthesizing, making meaning. That's why we think high-impact practices are high impact. So, Not incidentally, like when you're running a center for teaching and learning like I did for 13 years, what we do is we work with faculty, try to make their classes do more of those things. But they also know intuitively what we now know from sources like the Gallup-Purdue poll. 30,000 alumni surveyed whether they're flourishing and engaged in work 20 years after college. And they ask a whole bunch of other questions, such as, have you been honored by your community for your contributions to a community? Then they ask them, what did you do in college? What kind of experience did you have? So here's the punchline. You're 74% more likely to be engaged in work and flourishing 20 years after college if these two things happen to you. If you had an adult mentor that cared about you, and if you worked on a sustained project for a semester or longer. That's it. And it doesn't matter where you went. You could have gone anywhere. If you had those two things, it had a huge impact. Now, you were maybe more likely to have those two things at certain places. Here's a little bit more data. But only 32% of students, alumni nationally, say they had a project semester or longer. Only 30% had internship, only 20% extremely involved. Only 6% had all three. But it's not just about projects, it's about what it means to interact with adults helping you with those projects. So 64% had a professor who made me excited about learning. Fortunately, that's like one of the larger numbers, although, God, you'd hope, right? Like 4 years, a professor that made me excited about learning. How high a bar is that? But only 27% had a professor who cared about me as a person. 22% a mentor who encouraged me. 14% had all three. Kind of interesting to think about. What are the numbers here? I think from the top, or from 10,000 feet, it looks like tons of this is going on. What would the percentages look like, and for whom? What if you segmented it by Pell Grant recipients, for example? I think what the students also know, and of course they know it in part because they're at Georgetown, Jesuit institution, where we talk a lot about what it means to educate the whole person. Right? We use the word formation a lot at Georgetown, the work of formation, where it's the job of the individual to be developing yourself and the job of the institution to create an environment in which individuals can be continually in the act of developing your full self, what our president would call your authentic self. This is what I mean about when I talk about the whole person, that we're educating not just for knowledge and not just for skills, but for dispositions. And if you can stand to talk about values, values. Those are some of the dispositions that I would think are important. Openness to learning. Of course, critical thinking is there, but creativity, resilience, empathy, right? Humility, ethical judgment. This is what I like to call the hard skills. And this is in contrast to the so-called soft skills, like econometrics, biostatistics, chemistry, calculus, stuff you can learn in classrooms. These are the hard skills. But one of the things that makes them hard is that you can't teach them. You can only create environments in which they are cultivated. And that, I think, is what's a huge question for us moving forward. There is no such thing as direct instruction in resilience. Now, some direct instruction may lead to the need for resilience, but so here are my circles now maneuvered in a different way. So now I have the formal curriculum and the experiential co-curriculum overlapping, and I'll get to that in a minute. But on your left, that big rectangle is what I call the generic and interchangeable part of the curriculum. And if anything happened in the rise and semi-fall of MOOCs over the last 5 years, is that it exposed the generic and interchangeable part of the curriculum as generic and interchangeable. 20,000 Introduction to Statistics courses taught in the United States this spring, all with more or less the same content. Now, it doesn't mean you don't have a great one. I'm married to someone who teaches the first semester of Foundations of Biology, greatest course in the United States. And I'm not just saying that, though I would, but... but she teaches it as a course that could not be done virtually. She teaches it as a community of people who are on a journey together. But anything in that space that's not taught with its own justification for why would I come here and pay retail for intro to whatever is eventually going to get sucked out into the webosphere. Right? So I'll come back to that in a second. On the other side, that other rectangle or that other circle is what I would say is what it is about every university that's irreducibly local. So those are the two extremes. There's something, for Georgetown, we're Jesuit and Catholic. We're in Washington, D.C. We're residential. We're international, right? You'd have your list. So I think over the next 10 to 20 years, more and more of the generic and interchangeable stuff is going to get sucked out. Already, there are so many options for how you learn stuff, and I'll talk about that in a second. Or it's going to say, if we're going to do it here, what's our reasoning? What are we really teaching? We're not teaching intro to statistics. We're initiating people into inquiry, into climate change or food justice using quantitative reasoning. We're not teaching introduction to statistics. Because it's in that center where I think we have to live. We, meaning higher education. We, meaning universities like Georgetown and Denver. That's where you create whole people. That's where you create ethical individuals. That's where you create practitioners and kind of fully committed professionals. And I think in that high impact circle, that's where yogis are. That's where communities of practice could do their work. That might be what it looks like to imagine building a university around the highest impact part of the formal curriculum and the most learning intensive part of the experiential co-curriculum. So, how do we design for this center? And some of this that I'm going to show you is coming out of a publication that I'm co-writing with a kind of career-long partner, Brett Einen, who's sort of my counterpart at LaGuardia Community College. And I'm really just showing you this to honor that this work is his, not to move units, which will be out at the end of June, but no, I'm just kidding. So part of what Brett and I are trying to, in this book on open and integrative, we're trying to help reframe the conversation about technology in higher education, but it's relevant here. And there's kind of three ideas that we want to promote. One is stop talking about technology and start talking about the whole learning ecosystem. So it's not about tools, it's not about stuff you can buy. Personalized learning is not a thing you can buy, right? But it's a thing you can do. So that's part of it. The second is shifting from the conversation around unbundling to what we call rebundling. And that's what I really want to talk about here. And then in a rebundled higher education, we have to be building around the concept of the whole person. So we're all familiar with like the 5 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Declining public funding, rise in accountability, expanded access of new demographics of students, explosion of online learning, rise of data-driven, analytics-driven educational options. And especially it's the so-called digital evolution that's been driving it, but the narrative has been very much about how to use technologies to scale up, automate, reduce instructional costs. And that's given rise, as you all know, to this huge discourse around unbundling. Right? These are all books that have been published in the last year. I was thinking every time I see this slide, I want to write a book with the title, Everything's Fine. just make a bunch of stuff up and make a bunch of money like a couple of these books did, And part of the notion of this, part of this discourse has been that unbundling is equal to equity. That somehow learning anytime, anywhere, like as if the university model is broken, that we're ill-serving this generation, and that the unbundling of services is more equitable. But we now actually have a lot of data that says that's not the case, but I won't go into that. So that's kind of where we are. I think, all of these disruptive forces sit in this expanding digital ecosystem represented by my gorgeously designed 4 PowerPoint boxes. Right? We're in a world of networks, a world where we can share, a world driven by algorithms, a world of incredible participatory worldwide creation, a world of abundant resources. And in this context, I think that this is the central tension of our time. Not between face-to-face and online, not between profit, for-profit, nonprofit. It's between whether you have a fundamentally integrated vision of education or a disintegrated vision of education. Here's what I mean by that. So here, to me, are 2 paradigms of education that are operating right now. So one is the one that has really come out of the digital revolution. It's the one that is being incorporated in all kinds of fantastic ways, but also very much part of the Silicon Valley discourse. And it's the design of discrete learning activities, how you can learn targeted things online, Khan Academy, Code Academy, Udemy, Straighterline, lynda.com. Right? All good in their content, but the idea that what it means to learn something is to learn something discrete for a very particular reason. Anytime, anywhere, analytics-driven, micro-concepts. On the other side, is the kind of vision that's being driven here. What is it? Curriculum, co-curriculum, working together, trying to educate whole people. That what we're fundamentally about is teaching students how to make connections, how to think integratively. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of venture capital pouring in on the left. Hundreds of dollars pouring in on the right. And it's easier, certainly it was easy for a while to see this as kind of like good and evil, or like the left-hand side was like the cool disruptors, and the right-hand side was the legacy institutions and inertia. So what we mean by rebundling is simply this, that the only way we can imagine a future is if we learn how to put the left in service of the right. I think the only way we can afford to be embodiments of the right is to be able to put what's on the left in service to the right and understand their synergies. So I think we need a new synthesis, and that's what we call rebundling. And I think if we were inventing the university at this moment in history, that's where one of the places we would start, is how do we use the stuff that we're creating now to ensure equitable access to the kind of education that we value most deeply. And I think that's the version of the future that higher ed needs to write for itself. We've let Silicon Valley write our future of higher education. And they've gotten part of it right, and they've gotten part of it wrong. But we have not had a vision of our own future that is that progressive or that of this century. And I think that's incumbent on us to do that. So I kind of am on track time-wise. Should I give you like some quick examples of what we're doing at Georgetown? Usually I'm like here and I'm like, a third of my way through my slides like, oh crap. So here's just a few quick examples. And again, this is like really small stuff, but this is kind of how I think of rebundling happening at Georgetown. So I'm just going to show you 4 examples of projects. One of our projects that we ran last summer, running again this summer, is called Social Justice Intersections. We have students, as you do, who go all over the world in the summer and engage in social justice immersion projects. They're teaching English in Bangladesh, they're digging wells in Kazakhstan, they're doing development work in Tanzania. And we can't mentor them when they're all over the world and by themselves. So our Center for Social Justice created an online course called Intersections, where students enroll for 8 weeks in a reflective community, and they have to stay in that community for 8 weeks and reflect with each other on the arc of their experience. while they're around the world. And then every 2.5 weeks, they have the option to register for a different one-credit module. That's a skills-based module that helps them do their work on the ground. This summer, we're expanding it out to more modules. The vision is that eventually we'd have this huge menu of skills modules that could tie to a whole huge range of contexts and then create these small reflective communities. So students are both processing their experience in a reflective community, they're in the field, and they're getting skills that are pertinent to them. And it's a really simple idea, but it just begins with the premise we now no longer have to make the choice that someone's either here or they're there. Someone's either in a classroom or they're in the field. And amazingly, not a single person all over the world had trouble getting online last summer when we offered this course. Like, we couldn't even have thought about this 5 years ago. It's something we call experience wrapping. The experience is the primary thing, but then we ask, what can we wrap around it to make it a value-added experience and a credit-bearing experience? And the credit-bearing is critical because it means that students can get progress to degree. It makes those kinds of experiences more equitable because, for the most part, only higher socioeconomic status students can do non-credit-bearing things in the summer. And it means that we can start counting faculty mentorship in it as load. So it's very important that it's for credit. But some students take it for 1 credit, some for 2, some for 3. So it's variable and it's modular. Here's another one, a wonderful project we're launching this fall called Challenges in Childhood and Society, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Child Development and Health. Great collaboration between our Med Center and our Psych department. They basically took what they wanted to do was a very rich, coherent experience of an interdisciplinary introduction to child health. It has a didactic, theoretical component. They wanted to take students out into the community to sites where children are in various kinds of settings. They wanted to do sort of design thinking policy work, and they wanted to be able to teach hot topics. And at first they had this big, huge, bulky multi-credit thing, and then they decomposed it into a series of 1-credit modules. So now there's a 1-credit, 1-month module that's just theory. You have to take that first. Then if you want, you can move on and take the community piece. Then you can take the policy piece. Or you can do nothing and do the policy piece. Then you can do the community piece. And the beauty of this is that I turned off my screen. The beauty of this is that at first when we offer it, you could just take it as a 3-credit course, but it's designed to basically be taken in any order. Right? So students could do 1 or 2 credits in the fall, a couple of credits in the spring, and when the student decides, I'm ready to tie this off as a 3 or 4 credit course, they just elect to do that assessment as an integrative assessment. So we're trying to say, what would be possible if we actually modularize part of the curriculum? It makes the finances of connecting Med Center to main campus far better because the Med Center is used to teaching in short-term modules, not in semesters. I mean, my God, on the list of things that are difficult, there's like world peace, and then there's getting tuition dollars back to the medical center. Right? the most intractable human problem was that we're on semesters and they count percentages of people's time. But rethinking this in modules has made all this incredibly easier. Now we're starting to think, geez, and this passed unanimously, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. Now we're thinking, what else can we do this way? Now I'm trying to gather a bunch of faculty in the fall to create a multi-module curriculum around climate change that would be all modular. Students might take a science unit, then they might move to an ethics unit, they might come back to a science unit, they might go to a cultural studies unit, and they decide how they want to maneuver their way through a kind of thoughtful quilt of modules built all around an interdisciplinary approach to climate change. Another project, something we just launched called the Regent Science Scholars Program, trying to address the really difficult problem of retaining first-generation students, low-income students in STEM fields. Right? It has 2 components. The first is a 5-week residency, which everyone in the literature says is what you need to do. But the second, because many of these students really need to go home to their families in the summer, is to create an online environment that's highly personalized and that it's basically built on the same as the intersections model to prevent summer knowledge melt, to help sustain them. If you're going to create a Yugi-centric university, then you have to figure out how do you get everybody a level playing field chance to do that kind of work intensively. Last project I'll just share is we're going the other way. So some of the things we're doing are modular, breaking things down. Other things we're doing are now creating these more sustained structures. And we have this growing studio ecosystem of sustained year-long communities where students can work on sustained projects for a year, maybe longer. So one of them is Urban Studio, a group of urban studies faculty, where students who take a course on urban studies can then apply to get into a year-long urban studio, mentored by multiple faculty, credit-bearing, linked to the community. Basically, it's a Yugi. We have a whole number of these studios developing all around the campus. To make this kind of system work, it's not just about clever new structures. At some point, we realized we had to deal with some of the nature of the actual system. But we found that it was much easier to get people to want to talk about big things once we had a few small, concrete, boundary-pushing projects in place. So we created a course number that never had existed, which is a course number that doesn't belong to a school. We now have UNXP courses, which stands for University-Wide Experimental, and UNXD, which is University-Wide Cross-Disciplinary. I now have an advisory committee constituted of representatives of all the curriculum committees of the 9 schools, and they have total authority to approve. Their sole purpose is to approve pilots and get them into the system. And if it's a course, they have sole authority for approval as a pilot. Doesn't have to then go to the schools. If it's a program, it has to go to the schools. We're starting a task force on expanding the ways we measure teaching effort, and I'm almost certain we're going to end up not counting load by courses, but counting load by credits, as well as other things. And we can also convene big conversations like, when are we going to stop thinking of summer as a different term? So I'm going to leave you with a last image. I think one of the consequences of reimagining a university that starts to become more agile, it has more modular kinds of structures, more connected structures, is also just a fundamental paradigmatic shift to no longer just thinking that integration is about the 4-year bundle. I think there's a sense in which, and this is very important, this tension between integrative and disintegrative. Just because you have buildings doesn't mean you're necessarily offering an integrative education. I think we have to work at that integration. But I think we've tended to think that integration somehow is what comes out at the end. It's somehow part of the whole experience. But can we reimagine integration as something that comes from inside each fundamental experience? So this is the image I want to leave you with, and this is something that, again, my wife, this is her image. She says every course that she teaches, whether it's her large 250-person Foundations of Biology course or any other course, she tries to have her students live at this intersection, the intersection of the knowledge of the domain, knowledge of the world, and knowledge of the self. And she says if you're not thinking about all 3 of those things, then you're actually getting what color theorists would call subtractive effect, right? Like when you project onto paper. But if you're spotlighting all 3 of those things, then you're actually getting a white space, a space of possibility at the center of them. And what I want to suggest is that whether it's a Yugi or communities of practice or something else like that, where our value will be in a world in which you can learn a million things online in a million powerful ways, will be constructing that kind of space of possibility for students that sits somewhere at that intersection. And I have presented this places, and I have had faculty tell me, sorry, I was hired to do blue, right? I'm just an associate professor of blue. And I don't know where they're getting red. Maybe on their internships, and green is like, I don't know, the rest of their lives. But I don't need to worry about that. And that's okay. But what is the norm of what we think is at the center of what we're doing? It doesn't mean everybody has to do this all the time, but what is the core of our vision of who we are? And I would suggest it needs to be something like this if we want to be deeply relevant to our culture 20 or 30 years from now. Thank you.
So I would suggest, because I've got a question, if you guys don't mind, we're going to take 5 minutes out of our 15-minute break to ask questions. Since I stood up first, I can ask you first. And then we'll take a 10-minute break and I'll introduce George. So my question, Randy, if you would, maybe you could walk us through the Regents Science Scholars Program, right? So it's fascinating. How did that happen? We see the outcome, but what were the steps and who was involved to sort of get to whether that was a thing that actually happened?
Part of it is a really complicated story that I won't go into that is also kind of quirky, fascinating, but not relevant here.
You can answer the question I should have asked.
So first it began with data. Well, no, first it began with faculty in the sciences watching faces disappear over the course of the first semester. Then it went to data and said, look, we're looking at our high-level graduation data and we're at 90-something%. But let's now break that down and look at what actually happens to the students who come from mediocre high schools graduating at the top of their class and they come thinking they're going to be doctors, and by October they failed their first exam. Then it was saying, what do we have currently that we can expand? So this really builds on things that are really successful already, Community Scholars Program, Georgetown Scholarship Program. And then asking what are the innovations that we could leverage to be able to make this happen? And then ultimately, there was a donor who said, I want to make something happen in this space. And he said, what's a need? And we said, we would like to take this up to the next level. But what it takes to pull this off is, again, making connections that haven't been connected. Dean's office, student affairs, academic affairs, innovation people, people in the sciences. My wife, who's leading this program, she refers to them as the rebel forces. She's out buying lightsabers. But there's all these rebel forces all over campus that weren't talking to each other. They were all fighting this labor around first gen and trying to keep these folks in school. Not connected. So that's sort of one answer.
I'm actually a transplant from Georgetown. Could you comment on the academically, it's kind of been under the radar for the past 10 years, but all the medical students go through meditation and mindfulness classes to enhance the knowledge of yourself and cultural transformation to the point where we've recently been asked by the law school, believe it or not, to start classes with the first-year law students. And I feel that preparing the human being for change and to have a fertile, intellectual, and heartfelt soil to have all these phenomenal ideas is a vital part. And in addition to that, what are you doing to enhance the fear of the faculty for change, and how are we preparing them to face the future?
So on the student side, we're talking about that a lot. We have actually a very rapidly growing course on flourishing. That's a first-year course. We're trying to develop a well-being course in the first semester, trying to figure out how integratively to connect a lot of well-being kinds of activities into the heart of the academic enterprise. We also have a long-standing program that does that in the context of courses called the Engelhard Project. But we're very mindful that this is not a speed up on students. I think a premise of mine is that we've maxed out the system. Student time and energy is maxed out. Faculty time is maxed out. What the university can afford is maxed out. So this has to be about slowing down, integrating, et cetera. I think part of our perception of bringing some of the co-curriculum under the credit-bearing model is helping students feel like it isn't just more and more, but there's actually some things being connected. With faculty, I think our approach has been trying to say two things. One, whatever you're doing, you're just great. You just keep doing that. If like this doesn't interest you, you are great. There's no reason that everybody has to change. We're just saying we would like to remove the constraints for new things to happen. And the new things that we want to happen, we want them to be the things that people feel are the fullest expression of who they are as a faculty member. And the people who want to do that, we just want to get the constraints out of their way. It's really not about a religious conversion. And I say that, having run a center for teaching for over a decade, I was out there trying to show people the way, preaching the book of active learning and formative feedback. But it's really, what do you care about? And then here we think is a way, that's why making faculty professional lives better. Make it more flexible, make it more agile, make your quality of teaching better connect your research to your teaching, have your students be more engaged, reimagine what an instructional community looks like so all the burden doesn't fall on you, developing an infrastructure that supports you if you want to do something new. It doesn't cost you your next article because you're running around town trying to make arrangements for something. How do we make it possible for faculty to comfortably step in to an environment that helps them change? We owe that to faculty. It is not faculty's problem that they do not act against their own self-interests. It's our problem.
So by way of, first it was great to hear these two conclude their little conversation by yes, 1,000 times yes. So that's a good sign. I also thought by way of reintroduction, it would be great to re-quote something that Randy said. It's a little bit, it's a bit of a bastardization, so excuse me, but I thought in having George speak, who has spent quite a bit of time in Silicon Valley, I'd echo what you'd said, which is that we've let Silicon Valley write our future. And I thought that was a great way
to introduce me?
To introduce you.
That's great.
And the D.school. George, thanks for being
awesome.
here.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Great. My preference is to be out here. So I think we have about 40 minutes for the next session and then another break. And I think it's really unexpected for me the way I think what we're going to talk about fit together. I was asked to tell a little bit about what's the D.school story? Like, how did it come to be? And from that, maybe it would give some encouragement or hope in the work that you're venturing out on. And so in some sense, I think the way I see it is, Randy was just talking about some of the threads and what they're pointing to going forward. And I think the D.school story is going to be more, I'm going to draw from the past as a way to say, well, how do you start on something new? A lot of the times when you were just at the D.school meeting with Sarah, you were talking about, when we walk people through the D.school, they look at it and go, wow, we can't do this. Like, it's a big building, we raise a lot of money, and then they lose sight of how it started. Like, it's not evident, like it's not tangible how it started, and I think that's the thing I really want to put out there. The other thing is I don't have a feel for which stories would be meaningful for you. So I'm going to start well, here's a picture of my 3 boys. And this was taken a few years ago. So they're now like 11, 9, and 7. And Jonah, who's on the left, is about this tall now. And my question, when you look at these kids, and I think about it, my experience, I never thought I would work in a university setting as an entrepreneur. But being a part of the D.school and leading it for the last 11 years, and now in my global work, it has fundamentally reshaped my view of what creativity is, how leadership happens, and about education. And it hits me here as a father when I'm thinking about, like, how should I be thinking about universities in their path? Should I or not? And when I see them, I ask questions like, well, how do we design the future of the university? Does anyone have an idea what the future of the university should be? Sure. Yeah? No, that would be great. Like the hour-long workshop where we solve it, we don't have to do it. We can just say, we've got it, and we can move on. What's it? Ooh, yeah, maybe. Do we really know? We have no idea. And I think that's ultimately the problem, is we know we need to start evolving, but we don't know towards what. And I would say most of our industrial strategies for the last 100 years have been attuned to help us know how to point ourselves towards where we want to go, set a goal, a vision, and align our resources towards getting to that. And I think in a world that we're entering, we don't have that luxury anymore. As soon as you articulate a future goal, you're probably either wrong, or maybe you're right, but the world's going to change so fast it'll be irrelevant. And so the cost of planning now exceeds the cost of experimentation. And I don't think we know quite how to hold ourselves and lead a group towards unknown outcomes, because I think everyone's looking to us wanting to know where we're going. So hopefully the D.school story will be a way, well, how do you move towards an unknown future in an action-oriented way? Because if you keep just thinking about it, you're not going to come up with it. So how do you lead yourself towards unknown futures in an action-oriented way? So maybe I'll start by asking you to reflect a little bit. Just take a minute personally first and to ask the question, how many people are familiar with the D.school? Most, okay. And if you don't, we're still trying to figure out what it is. It's fine. But if you think about what you're facing, or maybe what you know about the D.school, your perception of it, I'm interested in like what would be most meaningful for you to hear. Because there's stories that I can draw on from what the faculty students experience is, to the student experience, to how we set the conditions for creativity to emerge. And I've got like 5 different threads or 7 different threads that I can go down, and I want to prioritize that for you guys in terms of where primary interest goes. So take a moment and ask, if I got to find out one thing about the D.school or my experience, what would it be? Can you take a minute to do that? Are you guys doing it? I can't tell. Okay. Some of you just went, whoop. And I want to get a couple of them out, because it'll help frame the context. Okay, so what we're going to do is, if someone feels like they have something that they want to put out there, then let's get some of those out. And if you resonate with that, some of our early education kids have taught us you could do this. And it just says that, oh, other people feel that in the room. You don't have to do this. Just give some indication. Okay. Who has something that they would really love to know about?
Okay, so JP said he would give me a dime if I said this.
Okay. I'll give you a quarter if you don't.
If I could create a love child, it would be between you and Randy Bass.
Nice.
And because I've been following both of your work forever, and that's what my interest comes out of, which is a question about how do we incubate or create the conditions within higher education to allow for change processes, creativity, and reinvention for any interested party.
Yes. Love it. Yeah. I will do that. Yeah. What I love about listening to Randy is I think we're saying the same thing in different language. We're like pointing to the same thing. So I took like 2 pages of notes. What else?
Yeah, I had to, it's not really different, but maybe in a little bit. It's, how specific to Stanford and Silicon Valley is the experience? Because I think there's a perception that, well, that's there, and you can't do that there without all those other conditions that are Silicon Valley and Stanford being there too.
Great, yeah. So before I launched, I'll just say 1 minute on this. Before I I just felt the entrepreneurial instinct, very similar to the feeling I had when I'm like, oh, design could be something bigger at Stanford. About 3 years ago, I had the instinct that Stanford's important, but this is needed globally. So I started to shift my attention to how do we unleash creativity globally. I don't know how to do something like that. So the first thing I did is I put my family on a ship. It's called Semester at Sea. It's a floating university, and worked with a local social impact entrepreneur, and we co-ran a social impact accelerator with entrepreneurs, with D.school-like learning, and 100 students and entrepreneurs prototyping their businesses going to 12 different countries. And all that to say, I learned 2 things. One, the most important thing, unleashing collaboration and creativity and this type of learning is universally human. It's not Silicon Valley. And the second thing I learned is I moved my family to Boulder, because I think Silicon Valley is starting to erode itself from the inside out. And this ecosystem, to me, I think can play a game that Silicon Valley can't. And so I think we have a chance to ask the question, what is this place like? And let's lead from there, as opposed to, I don't think Silicon Valley is steering anymore. I think still in the press it is. Okay, what else? Yeah?
Yeah, so I'm especially, and I'll use some of Randy's language, interested in how you remove the constraints from faculty so that they can do what they really love and what they're really
Yes.
good at.
Yes.
It's kind of intellectual play and creation.
Yes. Setting conditions, removing constraints. Any other? Yeah?
I'm going to ask the cynic question, which is,
Cool.
we teach in the arts and design area already, and so the D.school has always been a weird buzzword that other disciplines are using, but seems obvious to us.
Yes.
So I think a lot of us who haven't drunk the Kool-Aid, it would be great to get a better picture of, how that
What is
comes
it?
together. Yeah.
Interesting.
Maybe around design thinking and interdisciplinary.
Yeah? Like what's the link between them? Yeah, I would say design thinking is like a buzzword term. It's an interim term in my mind that invites a broader group of learners to a creative way of working. Like designers would consider themselves creative, most people would not. And so by adding the word design thinking, it's almost like horseless carriage. It's like a carriage, but without, it's the interim term on the way to the car. So to me, it's an interim term for an invitation to a more diverse group of learners to be intentional about how it's like a vocabulary of collaboration and an integrative learning process. So I think they're almost one and the same thing. Yeah?
How do you deal with the need for self-growth and self-actualization, given the explosion of technology, which the constraint could be dehumanizing?
Yeah, interesting. Which almost links to Randy's comment about whole self and things like that. I'll come to that, I think, at the end. What, any more? And then So now what I'd like you to do is get in a pair. We'll come back to the group of three. Get in a pair. Make sure you have a partner. Okay. All right. Does someone need a partner? So thank you, because I need to demo it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm not going to really tell you what this is about. You're not going to know going in. Most students are like, tell me exactly what the class is about. So I'm going to give you an experience. Here's what I would ask. Step in as a learner, lean into the experience, pay attention to what's happening, and then we'll talk about at the end, what was that about? What did it mean to you? And this one I've also done all over the world and with my kids, and they love. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to give you a very simple task to do with your partner. All you have to do is count to 3 over and over again. Like 1, 2, 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2.
1, 2.
Yeah. Okay. That's all you have to do, over and over again. If you're not messing up, you're not going fast enough. Okay? So see, we did it. May I ask your permission? We need to sort of do a call and response like the blues. I'll give you something, you do it, and then listen for me. Like, all right, stop. And so stop. And then turn around, I'll give you another prompt. Do I have permission to sort of run the room that way? Yeah. Okay. All right, and your partner, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, as fast as you can. That was fast. Okay. Shh. You guys were done? Like, yeah. They stopped. I'm like, why'd you stop? Rebecca's like, I just kept messing up. Yeah. Did everyone mess up? Okay. Great. So we're going to do this 2 more times. Shh. We're going to do this 2 more times. Again, if something's in the way, move so that you're in your own space. We're going to do this 2 more times, and we're going to make it a little harder this time. You're like, it was already hard. Okay. So all I have to do now, so I'm going to give you the instructions, then I'm going to give you 1 more instruction. So there's 2 sets. So listen, don't just jump into it right away. You have to substitute a snap for the 1, but everything else is the same. Okay, so it goes like this.
2,
3, 2,
3,
2. Okay. Okay, see? It's a little trickier. So do that with your partner, and then I'd ask you to pay attention to one thing. Pay attention to what you do when you mess up. Okay? Go for it.
There must be some significant psychomotor thing.
There must be, right? Yeah. Okay. I love this. This is great. Shh. You guys, can we stop? Some of you guys are like, we will get this. Right? Okay. And Jim, what was Jim saying? So this isn't fair. Clearly, it's like above my abilities. So, okay, what did you notice? What did you do when you messed up? Cringed. You laughed. So a release of emotion. What else? Cringed. Start again. Thank goodness. You looked down. Yeah. What else did you do with your body? Follow that. Put your hand, pull back. Yep. Most of you broke connection with the person you're with. What else? Yep. And a lot of you turned away like this. What's going on? Shame. We have that label for sure. But why this? Embarrassment. Yeah, we had one person's like, now I've finally lost respect for you. What are we guarding against? Failure. So we grew up, biologically this makes sense, like in the Masai Mara, or as children, we grow up and we learn that there are consequences to messing up. And some are quite dangerous and some are just complicated. So we at a very unconscious level, we protect ourselves from that failure. And when we enter into new territory, when you protect yourself, you're closing yourself from the learning opportunity. And you become more, what is it called, myopic. And so one of the primary things, we talk about fail early, fail fast. I don't think the goal is about failing. The goal is how quickly can you learn? Try something. If you learn something, it's been a success. In order to accelerate that, we in ourselves, and definitely in the people you lead and in the students, have to start to shift your response towards failure, else you won't keep entering into that territory. So we're going to do it one more time and give you the chance to try to shift your response towards failure. Okay? And that is, we're going to make it harder. Oh, no. Yeah. Ready? So it's like, still the snap, and then we do a clap for 2. Okay? And then when you mess up, you both go ta-da. So it goes like this. 2, 3. Oh, ta-da. Okay. We didn't get very far. And then do it again. But just like ta-da when you mess up. Okay? 3, ta-da. Yeah, when either mess up, ta-da, and then do it again. Okay. Okay.
No, we failed twice. We're very successful.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to just chat real quickly. So what happened there? What happened there? What did it feel like that time? You guys, you didn't break contact. You stayed leaning in. It was more fun as opposed to tight. Did you notice? Last time you were tight because you noticed that this time everyone was more relaxed. What else? Yeah, it's like all of a sudden you've made it safe. Like you know it's not going to be too bad, and because the other person's not going to judge you, and they know that too. So it's like a social covenant. You've set that up, and so now everyone can lean in. Did anyone go fast? Anyone go faster? Slower. We've seen people go faster because they're relaxed, right, and more successful. Okay, I just want you to have that experience so that it sticks with you. I would say if there's anything to hold as you enter this territory, that's one of the fundamental ones. The second one I was going to do, which I won't do because I think I want to get into some stories, is around emotional safety. Like status difference, if someone doesn't feel safe to express what they observe or give their idea, then you don't know where the good ideas are going to come from, and they won't come out. And so reshifting your response to when things don't go the way you expected, that's what we just did, and creating an environment of emotional safety so everyone feels safe contributing, I would say are the two fundamental things. And usually both of those aren't present in corporations or universities when we are trying to drive transformation. And so if you want to try emotional safety, little activity, then in the next break, the type of prompt I would suggest that you have with someone is something that our d.shrink, we have a PhD in psychology who's a therapist, we brought him in with our students to help them deal with their interpersonal dynamics and creative work. And he would say, how are you doing? Really? What happens when I see someone I meet, I'm like, hey, how are you doing? What? Great. Why do we say that? Because you're supposed to, because I don't really want to know. And you don't, it's like we don't have the time, right? But you'd be surprised what people are carrying. And so to just say, how are you doing really? And for someone to be able to say that, immediately you've created a space for the human in the environment. And then they feel safe contributing. I think if you move in those two ways, then in this uncharted territory, you will hold your work more lightly. Okay, can you guys sit down? Let's get a few stories out. Some of the things I heard that were interesting is like, well, so how do you set the conditions for a new type of creative flourishing to happen? And I actually think that's where most of the work is. It's not designing, well, I think there's two things. Designing for the context that we're going into. I think the other one is designing the context. Is to me, creativity follows context, like water follows a landscape. So if you don't get to lead by pointing towards a direction, I think you get to steer by changing the context. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I think that's really where your leadership levers are, context and timing and rhythms. And then you can hand over agency to the people on what direction you go. But there's a feeling of a loss of control, which I think makes it harder for most leaders. So I want to touch on that, and then how do you involve faculty so that they bring their best selves to it? You framed it as how do you release constraints? And I'll talk a little about the faculty experience, and then I think there was a question around self-actualizing and also the Kool-Aid. I think we'll try to get through there. So I'll tell some stories, and I would suggest if you want to dig into any of them, just throw out a question, say, hey, can you tell us more about that? Or what's the implications of engaging faculty that way? And I'll just get through a few stories, and the goal is then also to have some time at the end. Okay. How many have been to Stanford? Isn't it amazing? 3,000 acres? At the heart of it, we didn't quite know what the d.school was. We came up with a name. It was to play off of b.school, not in any contrasting way, but aspirationally. One day we imagined that we might be able to create a place, one of many d.schools, like one of many b.schools, and it would be known in the world, and a certain type of leader would come from it. So that's where the d.school name came from. We immediately got in trouble from the president of the university that says, you can't just call yourself a school, because we're not a school. Like that's where faculty are, and that's who have budget and a lot of other things. So we kept calling ourselves a d.school, and now it's known that way. But we didn't quite know what it was. We had a hunch that it was inviting people into a collaborative, creative effort, directing those diverse perspectives into complex problems that challenge the world, allowing the students to engage in projects, all the things that we've heard was really significant 10 to 12 years ago. I think it was about 2002, 2003 when David and I started talking together. But we didn't fully know what it would be. And so we knew we had to use a design approach to design the d.school. So that's the secret, is use design thinking to design a design thinking environment. And what that means is almost how I started. We start by gaining empathy for who it is it's for. So we started asking the students, it's elective, like they don't have to be at the d.school. Even in the earliest days, they weren't required to be there, so they had to want to be there. So we needed to understand what was on their heart. So we asked them, well, what are the things that you're really interested in? And they talked about K-12 education and redesigning business and sustainability and health and wellness and all those things. So that's where we started planting our first project-based classes, is in those areas. Now it has evolved dramatically since, but we have this guiding principle is like when in doubt, do follow the students. And that sort of got us started. So these are some of the topic areas. And someone mentioned the Napkin Manifesto, I think. And this literally, we thought of it as a startup, not as an education program. And in Silicon Valley, all big startups start on a napkin in some coffee shop. So we thought if we can't put down what we believe in on a napkin, we probably don't quite have a sense. So it's not some, we didn't quite, David was a tenure line appointed faculty, but he got appointed not because he ever did a PhD, but on his impact in the world. And I'm just an entrepreneur. So neither of us really knew what we were doing, starting something in university. We didn't realize we had to run some strategic plan up to academic council. So we just did that. But it stayed true as our strategy for 10 years. Have you guys seen it online? Yeah. I would just reference it. And our intent, create the best design school period. It had profanity based on that sports show before. You can look that up. But the first one is, it's not about innovation, it's about the innovators. Prepare future innovators to be breakthrough thinkers and doers. Using a collaborative process, design thinking to inspire multidisciplinary teams, foster new kind of collaboration between faculty, students, and industry, and tackle big projects. That's what we had. What was on the heart of the students, and that approach. And then it's about getting started. And we're also thinking as a startup, we thought we'd go raise money, so we got some press. We got a guy named Hasso Plattner, his attention, he's the founder of SAP. He felt like he wanted to save Germany to be more innovative and enterprise software, so he thought I can learn from this, so he gave $35 million as the first gift. And that, at first, that's when Stanford thought it was a good idea, by the way. Before, they're like, you can't call it a school, all this stuff. But we just kept experimenting, and we had a story. By the time he came in, that's when they felt it was real. And so we have this big gift. And then, as you guys know, there's no free space. There's no extra space in the university. So the space we got was this double-wide trailer on the edge of campus that no one else wanted. I saw it, and I thought, we're going to have to give the money back to Hasso. And it turned out to be, and every year and a half, we had to move from one temporary space to another. And I think that turned out to be one of the most significant factors for helping us evolve the D.school and what it is today. So I don't think I would have chosen it going in. But now, if you'd ask me how would I launch an effort, I would say, well, Randy said this, start small and evolve your way forward. And somehow, if you start in a small space, when you move from one temporary space to another, humans, when you move space, expect there to be change. So you get to change more naturally as opposed to all that resistance that happens. So let me just give you a sense of, so you feel in a matter of years, like this is where it started, not in the big building that you tour today. And in some sense, I think giving yourself permission to be this crummy is the hard part. So we started in the trailer. Oh, actually, we started in a room before the trailer. Before we even got Haas's money, one of the deans had some dean's reserve space. It was just a room that happened to have a door on the outside, so we could pretend we could walk someone in from the outside like it was our space. And we painted the wall red, and that was where the D.school was. And then we got the trailer. And nothing fancy, and this is our first class. And I think we had 3 classes, about 30 to 40 students. And what I love about this picture is you don't know who the faculty are and who the students are. And most of the faculty, it's a team, Terry and me and David and Julian, here's our D-shrink. But you can tell the students are completely engaged. But that's how we started, and that's when we felt like we had a home. And then a year and a half later, we had to move into another space. Someone was not using a floor for a year. And then a year and a half after that, we got a whole bay. And then we got the final building, and this is sort of what it looks like now. And I think that's maybe one of the primary messages, in addition to just this holding yourself in emotional safety and recognizing the things that you try won't always work and being open to what happens as opposed to not taking that step. And then finding a way to force a rhythm of change. And I'll talk about, last night I think at dinner we talked about, is the thing you're building, are you designing for repeatability? We can do the same classes over and over again at scale, or are you designing for evolvability? I think in our current environment, we have to choose the latter. And which means almost every one of our mechanisms, like how you evaluate classes, what your quarterly schedule is, what your annual schedule is, how you use space, those could either drive towards more calcification or more towards evolvability. And that's the leadership choices to move it this way. I'll give some examples of that a little bit later. So let me just tell you a couple of arcs of experience, like a student arc, sort of a faculty arc, and then another role that I think wasn't really ever talked about formally, but I think was huge in the creation of the D.school.
Could you start using the mic, please?
Yes. I could hear myself. That was fine.
So you were the lawnmower.
Great. Does that work? Okay, better. Yay. What was that? So you can grab me after break or something, but I think the depth that we have an opportunity to talk about in conversation later is there are all these threads over the history of the D.school, like how the community evolved, or how our actual design thinking process evolved, or our D.school team, like the staff, or the use of space, or the program, on and on. And I'm not going to go through all those, just so you know that all those threads are in flight at the same time. So let me just tell you a little bit, like from the student journey. So a student comes from any one of the schools. So we're not an 8th school at Stanford, we're more like a school crossing. Very similar to what you guys have been talking about, a multidisciplinary center. So this is Jane, she came from the business school, and then she gets put on a team and given a real hard challenge that's close to her heart. So she cared about social impact, and the project she worked on was redesigning incubators, low-cost incubators for developing countries. She and her team launched a new, some of you may have heard of the project Embrace, where it's more than an infant warmer, like 2% of the cost of incubator. They then canceled all their big jobs offers and launched a company in India, and now is in clinical trials and saving, I don't know, something like 30,000 babies' lives. She just presented this to Obama, I think, twice. But that's the trajectory of a student. Like they're getting their primary degree, like in business or in law, and then they have this chance to intersect in an elective way on something they're interested in on a team setting for the diversity of perspectives on a real challenge. Let me tell you a little about the faculty experience. And I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg. And so any one of these can be areas that you can drop in and have questions. So when we started, this was a bit countercultural, but we needed to be seen as legitimate within the university. And so fortunately, David and others had taught with faculty across the university. And so this is Terry Winograd. He's in computer science. He was hardcore like AI, and then they thought he dismissed the real science because he thought humans were important in technology. So he was one of the fathers of human-computer interaction. Wonderful advisor to the Google twins and many others. But so Terry has been teaching sort of in a design thinking-like way for a long time with David. So in the early days of the D.school, really what the faculty relationship was, it was like David and me walking over to Terry's office and say, hey, Terry, we're doing this thing. Would you like to teach together? And because of the human connection, he's like, oh, I'm interested in trying that. Let's redesign the movie experience class. And then they'd walk together and form a teaching team. How many classes here are taught by a teaching team? Most team teaching, I think, at the time of the early days of the D.school, team teaching meant a faculty would show up for the first 2 weeks and then leave, and then another faculty would show up and then leave. And that gives diversity perspective. But the thing that we want to model for the students is what does it mean to work on a collaborative team when you don't always agree? And the faculty have rarely had that experience because they're anointed to be individual experts. And so we had to start with a relationship. It's like, would you like to teach together? And all the faculty, like a 3 to 4 person teaching team of faculty from diverse disciplines, are in the room at the same time. What do you think happens? What's that? Arguments, they don't agree. And then what do you think happens to the students? Yeah, it's great. What do you think their first worry is? Who's right? Yeah, who's doing the grading, right? And then they realize they're sort of all doing the grading. And then this switch happens. It does 2 things. It humanizes the faculty, and then it shifts the students realize they're now part of the discourse, that they can influence the conversation because they may have a point of view that's different as well. And we found this to be a very profound experience for the faculty, this team teaching, is all of a sudden they became learners again. And they got to learn from each other, and the relationships that developed among them. Like Terry's taught for, I don't know, 50 years or 30 years at Stanford, and for him, this was almost like a renewal of his career. And then I showed this picture. But that's, if you think about Terry's path, it's sort of like he's teaching alone in computer science, and then someone comes over and says, would you like to teach with me? And then he's on this team planning a class, designing a class together as opposed to just him. And then this is the experience he has. And he had this moment, because I think he was one of the most creative teachers that Stanford's had for a long time. But he had this insight in the D.school. It's like he realized about halfway through that teaching wasn't about sharing his idea, what he knew, and giving it to the students. It was more about creating a learning experience for the students. And we know that about creating learning experiences versus content transfer, but for a faculty member to have that aha about 35 years into their career, I think is really significant. But that's sort of the faculty arc. Let me tell you one more arc. So we have those going along, faculty on teams, designing classes, so students on teams can tackle it, and they're all learning together using the same type of creative approach that uses empathy and experimentation and iteration. So we have students going through here. It's like a flow of future innovators through the D.school from all the different disciplines. And we started what we call the D.school Fellows Program. It's like someone is going through, we find them to be really remarkable. Instead of them jumping out into some job in the industry, we invite them to apply and help us build the D.school. So spend another year and then graduate and then come be a part of the D.school team. And we put them in both teaching roles and operational roles. We actually commission them to do both. You have to know how to create learning experience for students and can build operational programs. So this is Sarah. You met Sarah. So this is Sarah when she was a business school student. And we were in the trailers. Yeah. And we asked when they sign up for a class, we take their picture and put the pictures all over the D.school, why you came to the D.school. This is 2005. So she's in business school. Why did she go to the D.school? To get out of the business school bubble and have some fun. That's the reason she came. But that experience completely changed her life. She took an extreme affordability social impact class. She then was on a team that designed a treadle pump that was impacting something like 50,000 families about water irrigation beyond an acre. And then we brought her back as a fellow, and she was part of the faculty of that social impact class. And we were trying to figure out what executive education was, and she had an interest in that. So I commissioned her. It's like, well, prototype what executive education might look like D.school style. So the birthing of almost all of our major foundations of the D.school, our K-12 lab, our executive education program, redesigning all the spaces, all were spearheaded by our fellows. In some ways, it's almost like the PhDs in the research lab, they're sort of like your labor. Maybe that's an unfair way to say it. It's like, who do you have to help build the organization? We had amazing talent do it. And so it's drawing on a pool to maybe grow parts of the programs that maybe you wouldn't otherwise do. Sarah then left and was doing global consulting and nonprofit work. And then I brought her back about 4 or 5 years later to be our managing director. And then once I shifted my attention globally, she now runs the D.school. So just that fellow path had a huge impact on the D.school. So thinking about who else you're involving into the birthing of all these different programs, I think is really significant. Okay, any questions so far? I'm going to come a little bit to the setting conditions. Do you still need me to use the mic? Yeah, okay. And the thing I just want to illustrate is some really tangible examples of what are some of the things you can tend to if you're taking small steps that can lean your work towards evolving work as opposed to something that tends to be more static. And you don't necessarily do this for all of your work. It's sort of like maybe you're running all these classes, they need to run on time, like the train's on time. Don't mess with those. But creating a space where you can do some experimentation, maybe apply some of these techniques in those areas. So and our goal is to have more iterations in everything we do. Because the more iterations, the more adaptations you get. And the more adaptations, the more evolution you get. So one of them is the daily adaptation of our class. So when you get a team together to design a class, it gets really hard to design it with like Excel or Word documents. Like, here's how everything's going to run scripted for 10 weeks. We're on the quarter system. That, and we wanted to continue to think of our classes as prototypes. Means try a day, and if it didn't work, adapt the next day, and then keep adapting from there. So we used a format. This was our syllabus on big sheets of paper and Post-it notes, and it looks unprecious for a reason. So that was our best guess of how class, like our boot camp class or introductory class, was going to work. And then we run the class, like with the students, like you saw in the trailer. And then after class, we sit down for 10 minutes and we debrief the class. And we ask them what worked and what didn't. And at first, the students, they sit there, and two things I think are significant. One is faculty are like, the students are going to tell us what worked and what didn't right to our faces. And the second one is this, the students would tell us, and then we go back and say, okay, well, wow, they definitely didn't get, this whole prototyping thing. We need to change the schedule. Let's add one more prototyping day. So we move a Post-it note, you add another Post-it note, and that's an easy change to make because you didn't overinvest in the syllabus. And then you go back the next day with the student and say, we heard you say that you didn't quit prototyping, so we've adapted the schedule. And then the students have this huge aha. They realize that they have a voice in the direction of their learning, as opposed to, how do we do it most of the time? You run the class, you do a survey at the end, and maybe the faculty might change something the next year. So to have a culture of feedback that can happen almost daily, we found was huge. And then having a syllabus that allowed us to adapt was really key. So that's one of the cycles. Another one is our workshops. So we had these big classes that were 10 weeks long. Once Sarah helped us launch the XITE program, we had a rhythm that was a class that was about a week long instead of 10 weeks long. And something really surprising happened. We realized we learned as much about learning experience design in a week as we did in 10 weeks. And so all of a sudden we had a faster cycle. So we had our regular quarters that were going like this, and now we could run week-long experiments. And anything we learned in the workshops around how we taught, how we set up space, how our teaching team worked, how we debriefed, if it did it better, we could bring that learning over to our quarter classes and vice versa. Same with K-12. You learn how to teach creativity to the kids. It's something you can use over in executive education. So having those threads, I think, really works. So now we have a weekly metabolism. Our curriculum evolves quarterly. So I don't quite know how this would work in a degree granting program. So the D-School is not degree granting. If you're degree granting, you need to make sure you get the students through a sequence of classes to get the credential. We don't have to do that. And so every quarter, we get to birth new classes. We don't have to teach the same one over again. And because we can do that, we can evolve every quarter what the whole set of classes are. And so that's an invitation, I think, in some senses. If you have to do the same curriculum over and over again, where do you have the space where you don't have to do that? Where you can release classes that don't work? Like one of our classes, we had 3 classes in the trailer. One of them was a disaster because it was a prototype. We didn't do that again. And the faculty felt safe to birth a new one. So now we have this cycle every quarter, the entire curriculum, the classes that come and go change. And then one more thing that I hinted at with all the moves. The team evolves yearly. Because we had these fellows involved on a 1-year cycle, we now had a chance to bring in new perspectives, have them build and grow the D-School, and then leave, and new perspectives. Most organizations do not have the ability to renew their teams. If you think of any business, they hire people, and the option is either keep them or fire them. And we're not talking faculty here, but you have in your student group a revolving community that can bring new perspectives in if they can help you build it, and then they leave. So now you have this annual cycle, and the last one would be moving every year, or moving every 2 years. So you saw the trailer, the next space in the final building. If you're moving every 2 years, I think that's the thing that surprised me the most, is every move allowed us to prototype the whole D-School again. So it wasn't just about prototyping the next space. We definitely got to do that. So our knowledge about what type of environment would be fruitful for the students kept evolving. But the more powerful thing was the thing that I mentioned, that is, every time we moved, we changed our space, and we could say, we used to meet that way, now we meet this way. We used to measure classes this way, now we measure it this way. We used to debrief this way, now we debrief that way. We commissioned classes this way, now we commission classes that way. And for some reason, we were able to People were like, okay. And they knew that it would only be for another year and a half. And if they didn't like it, we'd reboot it again. And so I don't see many examples that was the biggest surprise for me as an entrepreneur, to use a university rhythm to reboot the whole organization. As an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, you don't have that dramatic of a forcing function. You're just like spinning really fast. And so then you can think, how are you debriefing daily on your classes? How are you debriefing in your short classes, like workshops, quarterly, your curriculum, and the whole effort, a chance to reboot that. And my hunch is if you drive those cycles, you can be a little looser on what you need to do, because you can just try. It could be this or this or this, and you're renewing it and adapting every time you go. You hold yourself with that emotional safety and that attitude of this is just an experiment. And the students and the work will show you where to go. And I find the students are very engaged in that type of frontier work because they feel like a part of it. And here's part of the culture, the feedback, what it looks like at the end of a team. That's Julian, our d.shrink. And here's what it looks like at the end of a workshop. Like circling people around so they can see each other, as opposed to in rows listening to one professor. And if you want to start to use this right away, if you haven't heard the d.school technique, Julian taught us this, I think. Just the language, I think critique and feedback is poorly done. It's either too nice, you're like, that was great, because you don't want to hurt someone's feeling, or it's harsh. And so then people don't hear it. So how do we create the space for people to give good feedback? So we teach the language for our students and our faculty and our teams of I like and I wish. So I really liked that we tackled a big project in a week. I really liked that I was on a diverse team. I wish you didn't play music in class. I wish I got to try a new team the next time. And somehow that language of the things you like and I wish makes it both truthful, so we get the real stuff, and human, so we can hear it. So we teach that with our students and our faculty and others. Okay, I think that's about it on time. My goal was to give you the experience of, I think, the way you need to, what I found, hold yourself. To me, that's where most of it is. It's not the answers we have, it's just how we hold ourselves, with emotional safety with each other, and this idea that we can learn when things don't work as opposed to be afraid of when things don't work and judge it. That those two, and then shifting your attention from outcome-based leadership to more emergent leadership, which is driving rhythms and building a culture of feedback so you can adapt. And that then would allow you to start to grow a unique collaborative environment to this context, as opposed to which model we're going to bring in from the outside. Now, I have some stuff that we can talk about in terms of my global work now, but I think I'll save that for the break or something else. How are we on time? I would love questions. Yeah. Do we need... Great.
I like the way you are trying to bridge the gap between the work you've done and the work that's in front of us here. And I like the way you kind of took the Silicon Valley geographic piece and kind of set that aside. I wonder if you can do the same thing with the examples you used. When you use an example of an incubator that costs 2% of what it used to cost and save thousands of lives, you go, oh my God.
Yeah.
So what's the average experience of a team there? And would you celebrate that the same way? Would you feel a failure as a student if you, we didn't do that?
Yeah. Well, the students feel it. They're like, if I didn't launch a company, like, I'm a failure. So
what's the average experience like?
How
do you celebrate that?
Yeah, this is exceptional. And we have great stories of this, like our executives going through exec-ed, our kids going through the K-12 program, the teachers. But I think the primary, in the day-to-day, the project outcome is not what we celebrate, and it's not what we pay attention to. Ultimately, outcomes do have to have significant impact. So that's the downstream effect, is eventually we need to be sending kids out in the world that are going to be having significant impact. But that's not what we celebrate day to day. So I mentioned it's about the innovator, not the innovation, the d.school. So I told you the innovation, so you can say, yes, it works if people start to move this way. But I think it comes a little bit back to your question, is the thing we pay attention to is how the students work, not what comes out of their work. And so every critique as an example, or when the students deliver their prototype, we can give them feedback on what they did, and we also give them feedback on how they worked. So feedback on what they did, we're like, it's really exciting that you found an infant warmer that seems like it might be cost reducing. And then on the and it seems like you may have a way to deal with that economic model that will make that sustaining. But the more significant one is we will say, we really appreciate how you prototyped your way to that. Like you went through 20 prototypes in 2 weeks. Or that you had the courage to go out into the world and gain empathy for some of the mothers in Nepal. And that must have been a hard experience. That's where it was at. So to us, the things that are really important is not the incubator, but the small moments of bravery in when they were working on that. So a simple example, they were using the design thinking process. Instead of designing incubators in a lab, we sent them to Nepal. They're in the hospital, touring the hospital to gain empathy for the situation. Then they get walked into the infant ward, and it's filled with incubators. They thought that Nepal wouldn't have them because they're really expensive. They had a lot. And then the students right there can observe, why aren't there babies in the incubators? He asked the doctor, why aren't there babies in the incubator? And the doctor's like, oh, they don't survive the trip to the hospital. They're all born in country. They don't survive the trip to the hospital. And that's the moment where we need to celebrate, because that wasn't on the student's plan. They could have been like, oh, okay. At that moment, they said, we have to get out to the country because that's where the problem is. So they didn't tell the faculty, they bought themselves bus tickets and they went out into the country. And that's when they found the mothers who were losing their children. And that's when they realized it wasn't about cheaper incubators, it was about keeping them warm. And that's what gave them the reframe. So those little moments of bravery are the things that we look for in the students. It's the change in their behavior, as opposed to, I don't know what to do, so I'm just gonna think harder. We want them to go from that stance to, I don't know what to do, so I'm gonna lean into the world and gain empathy for someone or try something as an experiment with my team. If they move that way, we know eventually they'll get to the story that is big to hear. And I think that's really hard as humans because we tend to be very tangible. We tell that story and it was like, ooh, the incubator, as opposed to, let's go back to how they worked that led to that. And that's really where almost all the discussion and debrief is celebrated at the D.school. Yeah.
So I don't know that much about D.school. Do you give grades?
We fight over that.
How do you give grades?
We fight over that. And it's interesting what the faculty care about. The faculty really care about how they give grades. So when you put them on a team, they all have different philosophies of how someone should be measured. And so and what we allow is we allow each teaching team to have integrity of the learning experience they're designing and how they measure. And so different teaching teams decide how to do assessment differently. So I don't know if I have a good answer. A lot of classes are like, it's not about giving A, B, C. It's about you lean into it and you pass or fail. So some classes are pass-fail, some are graded. Often they maybe need to be graded because the students need a graded unit to apply it to their elective class in their home department. So it's very student-centered so that they decide based on what the students need. And it's also faculty-centered. They have to figure out what they're setting within the D.school. So I don't think there's a universal one. I don't know if that helps.
So it sounds like your outcomes are more in the affective domain than in the cognitive domain. Do you have rubrics for dealing with that and so on?
In the affective domain?
Yeah.
Again, I think a lot of it is based on the uniqueness of the teaching team decides. So this is another thing which I think is a little unobvious. I don't think of the D.school as an education program that we run. I think of it as an ecosystem and a portfolio of creative experiments, which you move in a more decentralized way. Our tendency in an industrial model is to consolidate patterns. And I think we do need to do that to do learning exchange. Hey, we do grading this way. How do you do it? And you can share that way. But in terms of deciding this is how we do it, would reduce variance. We're trying to create a whole living system. The D.school we want to run like a creative ecosystem, always adapting, always doing new things, which means we're releasing the central, usually desire to have more consolidated patterns because we want to increase variance. And so we're very tight on just a couple things. It's about nurturing creative behaviors in the innovator, the learner, doing it in an experiential way, using a creative process that's articulated roughly design thinking, but we're not even tight on that. and then releasing a ton, making sure you have a multidisciplinary teaching team. Those are mostly it. And then culture feedback and some of those other ones. And then we release almost everything else to the teaching teams, which creates a bit of a mess at one point. But you absorb that complexity because what you get from that is a flourishing that you don't get if you're trying to run it more of industrial style. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about how you deal with the tension between sort of valuing change, but also recognizing that if you find something that actually is sustainable, that you
Yes.
want to keep it.
Yes. Well, did you talk about the integrative and disintegrative? I think the living systems run on holding that tension. Best teams in Hollywood and others, they find the best teams have a combination of people who've worked well together, who would consolidate best practices, and new people who would not necessarily be attached to those practices, like almost half-half. So one of the best ways is just to have teams that have both existing and new people on it. Another one is a diversity of perspective, even on a team that works. So one of our longest standing classes is that extreme affordability one, the social impact one that Sarah and Jane was. That was run by a faculty, a business school faculty, Jim Patel, engineering and design, and then a fellow. And they had been on for 6, 7 years, 8 years, one of the longest standing. But because of the diversity of perspective, and they used the culture of feedback to adapt daily and quarterly, and they tracked that, they kept the things that worked and had this strong desire to keep evolving. I think it was something like 20% of the class stayed the same each year, and the rest changed. And what they kept and what didn't varied. But what they then accumulated, they built one of the strongest communities within the D.school, and some of the most impactful stories came from that. And it's not obvious, because you can say, well, that class has been around for 7, 8 years. It's not obvious. I had to talk to the faculty to realize that only 20% stayed the same. Yeah.
What's been the impact of the D.school on the rest of Stanford, and how has that been facilitated or managed?
Yeah. It's changed over time. At first it was, you can't call yourself a school. What are you doing? To, that's a lot of money. Maybe you should go for it. To you're under the radar, you're not causing a lot of problems, you should make sure more faculty are involved. To, while all the faculty want to do all their cool stuff there, we need them back in our home departments to make sure they cover their other classes. And then on the operational side, you can't spend money on iPhones. And we're like, we don't have desks. We don't have desk phones. We're not spending money on IT. We use cameras, so it's actually cheaper to give every employee an iPhone because that has a camera and a phone. But like all the way down to that and what we can reimburse. That's some of the global stuff. And because we just kept doing it, even before we got permission, we could then point to the student successes. The students just kept coming and the stories kept coming. And then now we had a lot of freedom. Like with the Capitol, we had the freedom to break the rules, and people were like, eh. But now I think it's grown enough that being a citizen of the university is something we have to be. And what's super exciting is now the university is, well, two things. From the student's perspective, students are choosing Stanford schools because of the D.school, and the D.school is not a school. They're choosing Stanford Business School over Harvard because of the D.school, or they're choosing Stanford Ed School over another ed school because of the D.school. So that's really interesting. We're amplifying all the schools as opposed to being depletive of it. And then other schools are learning, they're like, that's super interesting. So when they built the $400 million new business school campus, there's learning spaces that are D.school inspired, the engineering school and others. And then I think the leadership of the university wanted to think about the future of education, so they commissioned the D.school to do a project on Stanford 2025. So we then can almost run an experimental effort and reflect back to the university that. So it's been a really interesting journey. Yeah. Is this okay, time, question-wise?
Why don't we do, I hate being time cut, but I'm going to be time cut. How about one more question?
And I can be available. You just come grab me. We can drop into whatever you want. Yeah.
So I like your idea of changing a physical environment to consciously and subconsciously change the way you think.
Yes.
But then I was struck by a slide that illustrated that was by ever bigger boxes, even by square feet. So is that just a visual cue, or is there some assumption built in that you have to get bigger?
That was just what it was. We started really small, which I think was Usually when people get a lot of money, they take a big step. And we didn't have that choice. We got a lot of money and we had to take a small step. And I think that's what we want to do now, is take a small step, even if you have a lot of cash. And it just happened that each temporary space that opened up the next year was about double the size. So it was accidental, but it also allowed for more organic growth. And the demand started to grow. As the students had a great experience, they would tell other students. And so it just mapped pretty naturally. And what's not shown in here is, well, so then what do we do with the bigger box? And that, the more complex side of all the different layers, we first were really paying attention to team space, because everything, the one pattern across all the communities, students, faculty, staff, everything else, the one pattern is everyone's working like a 4-person collaborative team. So we realized, like in nature, when you find a pattern, that's the one we had to figure out. So in the early days, we were making sure we got the 4-person collaborative space working, and we put it everywhere. But then we get a bigger box, we've got those working, and now we need to think, well, what is a class, a studio? How do we get 10 teams working together, and 3 of those going at the same time? And where does the operational team sit? Then we get to a bigger box, and then we have bays and other things. And so it's very fractal, and some of the patterns that exist still persist, but it allowed us to go at higher forms. And so it's sort of like every student's on a 4-person team, the class is just 10 4-person teams. The building's running, it's got 10 classes running at the same time. And so it moves like that. And we were very conscious not to grow just because we could. It was more like keeping it special and keep experimenting was our driving force, not growing just in scale.
Great.
Great?
Thanks, good. So folks,
thanks you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you. Now, in terms of reporting out, I'm going to turn it to Randy, who's going to take us through I'm going to turn it to our team here. Who's going to take it forward.
Maybe I'll just add a little context, and then you can start drawing it out. So we just have a little conversation over here about, hey, we sent you to go get lunch, and this group got up and said, well, we were just starting to get into just starting to fight. And that brought up something that we were talking about, is we have some shared relationships with one of the venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, Greylock. It's been very successful. And there was an interesting piece about them a while ago. That is, they looked back at all of their deals, and all of their most successful deals were the ones they fought about. Now, there's healthy fighting and unhealthy fighting, but it wasn't the ones where they all agreed on, or all the ones that they didn't agree on. It's the ones that they had to wrestle with. In some sense, that's what you're starting to do in each group, is putting different perspectives around and starting to wrestle with, well, what's here? So I think in the spirit of that, I think is we want to just start getting out, well, what are some of the things that happened at each table?
And so, but rather than go table by table, we'll see if we can just kind of do this by jumping back and forth and giving different people the floor. So, and we'll do this based on who has the least in their mouth. So why don't we just start with the question of like most important things? Can people, let's just, kind of pop out some things, a table volunteer for us, a couple of things that were most important, and then we'll go table to table, and we'll get as many unique different ones out and see where there's agreement. Yeah.
Sure. So we had a whole list of things. Student access we thought was important. We thought learning communities was something that would be important. Student engagement, those are the types of things. We got kind of stuck on details a little bit, and so some of our time was spent on just trying to not get hung up on the details and the current construct that we're in right now.
So, great. A couple other kinds of things that I'm sure lots of people were building on those, but other sorts of things that were among your most important things?
So we had a few different things that we were really focusing on, including figuring out much more productive feedback processes, feeling that grades are probably not the best process. Among other things, really thinking about how to carve out more time for small-scale connection and feedback processes, as opposed to in bulk. And also really thinking about fewer but more intensive interactions. Like, for instance, we were thinking about what would it mean to have half as many classes, but that they're twice as long and as intense, so that you do a deeper dive in any given quarter or section of time, as opposed to being scattered.
Terrific, yeah. And a lot of these things would also then, I can tell, would just drive the sort of conditions that would flow from them, because you're already removing things as well as, privileging them.
But even imagine, just put those two together. Let's pay attention to student access, and then build in, start taking steps, but build in a quick and informal rapid feedback system. And you're off to the races. You're in a different direction than if you had approached it a different way.
Yeah.
Something that our group picked up on was the importance of space, and space is in quotation marks because we think that is physical space, tangible space, but also virtual space. And I might have missed some other kind of characterizations of it, but I think that Chancellor Chop was onto something earlier today when she said different spaces promote a different a learning style, and this space can be representative of the actual learning experience. So. And then we talked about integrated community, so that coming together as well as the learning experience, and I think that that's related to what's already been mentioned in terms of changing how feedback is given and delivered, and also how classes are actually structured and delivered.
I love the idea that space is more than just physical space. I think there's relational spaciousness and time spaciousness. These days, when things seem to be going faster and faster, I see a lot of accelerators. All these accelerators, we have to go faster. I think that usually makes things worse, because then we just go faster and harder with our old habits. So in times of change and complexity, I don't think it's about going faster, it's about seeing clearly of all the things that are happening, what's important. And so this idea of creating spaciousness, to me, is the place from which you say, oh, that's what's important. It's really, really significant.
Yeah. Other things that are big, important things that haven't been said yet.
Our discussion focused a lot on really identifying what the center is on campus that drives a lot of this activity, and I think one, keeping it at that level, but at a department level, really allowing the challenges to operate on their own. And the word that kept coming up that we talked through it was emphasizing resilience, and resilience from an institution, resilience from a faculty and future, resilience from a student experience perspective. So that was something that really tied to the notion of whole person building and around mentor-driven environment and activity. So those were some of the core critical aspects in addition to some of the things that were said that we found that were unique.
And it's interesting thinking about how you guys had to move the D.school, and you're always rethinking things. Resilience, we know, is related to just the right amount of stress and change. That resilience arises from a certain amount of change and a certain tolerable amount of stress. Yeah.
So we had a macro and a micro idea. The macro idea is called the magic portal of change. And that is this space in the center of the Venn diagram between faculty, students, administration, community, local, and global. And it's undergirded by a commitment to creativity and to evolution or change. And the work in that magic portal is reimagining knowledge, right? Teaching, learning, curriculum, assessment, recognition, reward, and then synergizing the curricular, co-curricular, and the world. Different kind of sites of learning, then it is surrounded by collaboration, inclusivity, interdisciplinarity, and access, which was free or reduced cost of education. And then our micro was that we do think that there needs to be a place for seeding change and growth through some type of incubation innovation space. It's not the D.school, it's not the Red House, but what is it for DU? And the things that would need to be is that it has to hold the space for change, so that's always part of, built into the institution. It has to create the conditions for evolution or for us to be at our growing edges, and it has to normalize flexibility.
Now I know why you came over and stole and then sharpened it. Because you did that. I love how that sets like the broad frame and you can be very specific actually. You usually get lost in the middle when that good frame is so actually.
Yeah. That's great, and you should tell the advancement office that you have a naming opportunity for the magic portal of change. They just need one donor, 8-figure gift would be I think Magic Portal deserves an 8-figure gift.
Another thing that I've heard between these two, resilience and the sport world change, it's something that's experienced at all scales. At the human scale, the students are trying to navigate change, faculty are trying to navigate change, the departments are trying to navigate change, the institutions are trying to navigate change. So it's one of those scale-independent issues. We need this integrated one.
Yeah, which actually makes it fractal, being able to think fractally. Let's shift to conditions, right? Probably should shift to conditions. Some thoughts about conditions that would make this possible.
Yeah, before conditions, the something we did talk about that was the importance, and I just heard it in Kate's as well, cross-disciplinary, the idea that has to be a touchstone for us. Values are extraordinarily important. We must set them up in advance. They have to be, experiential learning. All of those were touched on in the discussion this morning, and we thought that we can't move on without recognizing the importance.
Can I just say something about values real quick? It stuck with me ever since David Kelly said it to me in the trailer. And that is, most people, when they write down their values is super key. But usually what people do is they write them down and put them on the wall. So there's their values. And David's like, that's not what we want to do. We want to know what our values are, and they need to be embodied. You guys know this. But the equivalent example is, we value supporting students in diverse teams to manage that complexity. The way we embody it is just reading in the d.school. That person embodies our investment to support the students in navigating their interpersonal dynamics. So I think to the extent that you guys clear about your values, and always ask, where can I point to show that? It brings it alive until really just a corporation on the wall.
Reminded me of something Brandon Bastide from the Gallup people was speaking on our campus yesterday, and he has read 1,000 university mission statements. Yeah, can you imagine? Which I maybe just read one, because if you read one, you read 1,000. I don't know, but most common phrase of those 1,000 university mission statements: lifelong learning. He said, I've yet to find a university that measures lifelong learning, tracks lifelong learning, or necessarily even supports lifelong learning after graduation. Most common phrase, just in terms of how do you embody your values. Okay, other conditions. Who would like to speak to the conditions that would make these things possible? Yeah, and let's make sure we get as many voices in as possible.
So we'd like to insert diversity of thought, diversity of experience, and diversity of humans inside the center of that magic portal. And if we do that, then a condition becomes we actually have the compositional diversity at the faculty, staff, and student level.
Nice. Compositional diversity, yeah. Okay, other conditions people would like to speak to that emerged from your important things.
So one of the conditions we focused on was buy-in. So in order to support this community engagement, call it what you will, and it's connected with values and vision and everything, none of it works unless you have buy-in from a broad spectrum.
Because interdisciplinary collaboration was important, we thought that we needed to have twice as many faculty, give them half time off. Some flexibility around how we design departments. You know, we were thinking maybe we would have a period where they can trade and we'd have free agency.
Oh man, we could work that analogy, couldn't we?
If you just ask the question, where are students going to learn? I think that going to one place is over. So what does it mean? We just talked about faculty moving between learning institutions. That's how the earliest learning communities that formed the predecessors of the colleges in like Oxford, is they would move between nodes. The students are doing the same thing. What does it mean to take 2 classes, move between universities too? If you open yourself up, it can be quite fascinating.
A couple other conditions that you thought were necessary for your vision.
This was my thought, that we need a sustainable business model that's not tuition dependent.
Okay, other conditions?
I think we need to redefine who a faculty member and a staff member is. And part of that is less about, I'll just say it, labor power, and more of it is about professional, let people experiment. We talked about half of a person's job perhaps being more prescribed with a curriculum, and half of it being something that they can put together themselves with other folks, other faculty, other students. Because right now it is a very prescribed environment, both for faculty and staff.
Other conditions?
Okay. Well, we just talked about the fact that you have to remove constraints, and we all know that some of that has to do with the financial structures, the movement of dollars within the university and between schools and departments and so on. And those things have to be done to set up a condition for change.
Last couple comments, and then we'll turn it over to Chancellor Chop.
One thing we haven't discussed in the conditions is the closeness of the community around the project-based integrated activity on campus. And I think we really zeroed in on the internal and external elements around making sure the community is as close to their strategy as the institution is, to make sure that they're equally yoked as we're doing things within the community as well as within the institution itself.
Oh, you mean the community around the university?
Community around both world and individual disciplines.
And nobody's quite mentioned it, but it's certainly implied. I think it goes with the not one institution is also just institutions with much more porous boundaries than they've ever had, whether it's virtual or actually local. Last condition?
What I heard is two sort of things. One is some essentializing. You guys are getting to some pretty core essential values, and some willingness to be a bit radical on some of the conditions. And to me, having both of those present is a really great start.
Yeah. Well, and also trying to fundamentally change some of the things that have the effect of constraining the ability to be creative. So like if you go straight for a much broader sense of what assessment means, you actually are freeing up a lot of opportunity to do many other kinds of thinking around pedagogy and time and space, et cetera. Okay, so motion to approve. All in favor?
Ship it.
And as soon as Julia figures out how to pay for all this, we will move to this immediately. So I'm supposed to wrap it up, but let me begin by thanking Randy and George. You may not know this, but this is the first time they've met. And they're like the two leaders of creative thought in higher ed. So aren't we proud that we did this? And I also want to thank JB and his staff, because they're the ones who really pulled this off. So thank you. I actually thought in our closing that we'd just take a minute and identify lessons learned. So what are we taking from this? What are the rules, principles, language, stories? Let's just kind of build a collage, and I'll start with a couple. And mine are kind of about what I heard both of them together saying. So one was, I was really struck by integrative notions, the whole person, the exercise we did, the sense of the, the non-sectarian Jesuit philosophy of the whole person. I was sitting there thinking, wow, that's really important for DU to hear, because as a private, that's what we have to offer, that kind of holistic approach. I also heard both of them say context really matters. Creating that learning environment, the many senses of space. I heard both of them, and they literally both use this phrase, the freedom to break the rules. I don't think students can learn if they don't have the freedom to break the learn, and maybe we can't either. Another one was start small, evolve your way forward. I think there's that sense that we're not going to go through radical disruption. We've just got to keep evolving. And I love this phrase, just an experiment. Both of them talked about, it's just an experiment. That's all it is. We just have to create spaces for these experiments to flourish. And you know, when you think about it, the whole Enlightenment was about allowing people to have the freedom to just experiment in science, religion, and other fields. So what else? What are you going to remember tomorrow morning? Yes?
I was excited to hear how many of my peers were, or my colleagues, were so sort of excited at some of these similar notions of change and how to interrogate what we're doing.
Great. And what you got a diverse table too. In fact, we got a diverse group here. Yes.
We've been doing a big redesign the last few years, and I realized we thought we were making big strides, and I realized a lot of what we came up with, the river at Georgetown also came up with. So we need to go back and retool and keep pushing something more innovative.
Yeah, we just got to keep experimenting. Great.
So I love Randy's model, his wife's model of the domain knowledge, world knowledge, and self-knowledge. That just was the glue for me.
And how many times have we heard, I just do blue? I'll never forget that phrase. Pam.
I like George's point about increasing the frequency of assessment and evaluation of how a program is working and agreeing on a language around that. I like this, I wish that was different.
It's great. Frequency of assessment.
Very frequently and responding frequently.
Right. We can probably all still remember what it was like to sit in a college class and not get any feedback until you handed in your final paper. Creepy. Barbara. Yeah, build on the people who want to go. Others? Yes, Danny.
The emphasis on starting with the core values and core processes first and building from that, putting those in and never forgetting what is central to who we are, and then everything else follows from that.
I love some of these comments because I feel myself relaxing. It's like now it's manageable. If you work with the willing, you start on your core values, the mountain doesn't seem quite so high. Yes, Kate?
I really like what Randy said about students' incredible yearning for connecting to real stuff. I think if we keep that front and center, and that sense of the yearning and desire that motivates that, that's part of how we keep the energy in what we do. And then also, I'm really intrigued by Randy's notion of can we create environments in which this positions for but loads of learning that we don't often assess and raise the most important can really be intentionally cultivated.
I have to add just one little note, a plug for something for you all to watch. Becky Corliss, who many of you know, who runs ISLES, which is Greg, say it, Institute for the Advancement of American Legal Systems, this research center on a campus, gave the law school commencement address. And she's just been doing this massive study on what legal firms really want. And what they want is knowledge plus skills plus dispositions. So if you have time, it's like 7 or 8 minutes. She's a great speaker. It's really fascinating because it's a very data-based analysis. Others? Yes?
Randy's information early on, the value of student connections with their teachers and someone who makes them feel important and makes them feel like their ideas are valuable is really relevant when you talk about why these institutions, universities are so important. Because none of those online learning places can provide that.
It's also why this kind of small size research university is important. It's very hard if a student is in a class day after day after day with 500 other students for the faculty to get connected to them. Yes, JB?
One observation, I thought this felt like a really creative exercise and wasn't dystopian at all. And a lot of times I think in your presentation early on, you pointed out, we talk about these things, we tend to say, oh, disruption is coming at us. So this is much more of a formative, divergent, what can we do now? I think that was great.
Yes, Kate?
Two other things I really liked was this idea of disintegration and integration, and that Harvard Palmer talks about holding the paradox. And so much of what I think about is how can we hold the paradox both of them, and as you say, use disintegration to meet the integration. And then also George's notion of actually thinking that the rhythms of change in the university are compatible and not antagonistic. That was really freeing, because I always think it's the structure and the rhythm that makes us not be able to change it. You're really in this model for actually riding that wave within existing structures and institutions.
Okay, one more, and then we'll give Randy and George a final word.
I think building on both of these last comments is I think there's a great sense of hope, I think, for me for today. There is a possibility for change. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be also put in a nice little package, and that we'll get there. So if we will. So I think there's enough people for change.
Sounds good. I think we should rename the strategic plan DU Ecosystem of Experiments 2025. Okay, Randy, George, what did you learn? What final words?
Well, two things to me. One is just I sense in the room maybe that optimism and the openness to move in this direction, which gives me great hope. I'm really excited about what's here. And the second is, the more I've asked the question and tried to nurture creativity in contexts all over the world, the more I realize we all know how to do this already as humans. We always respond to different contexts. We always adapt. We keep learning is one of the things I think that really feeds us. And I think sometimes we put ourselves in institutions we let those things that distort our natural capacities. So I think I would just return to this idea, you guys know how to do this. And it's about creating the softness so you can start moving that way. So I feel that.
Yeah, and I would just take that up a level to say that universities are just human-created institutions. They're not fossil structures that we've inherited that we can't change. They are us, and that it really is completely possible to change. It's just you have to be able to think and act in a systemic way, because we've created these institutions that function by both autonomy and a kind of systemic, sort of homeostasis. But here's what I want to say, because nothing makes me feel better than people feeling hopeful after. Occasionally I go places and like it starts just generating retirements, but nothing feels better when somebody says, "Boy, you're the first person I've ever talked about the future that made me feel hopeful for the future." So that you mentioned hope is fantastic. We also know it's one of the great conditions for success. And trust me, I get around to a lot of institutions, and including doing some things kind of like this. Just this month, I've been to 2 other research universities that will remain nameless. On the spectrum, one will never get out of its own way. One has a community of believers, but they were all kind of on the margins. What just happened here, who's in this room, and what you guys are saying, and the leadership you have around the room and in the front of the room, you have the opportunity to do something really special here. And I say that from somebody who has a very recent sample of lots of other places trying to do what you do, and not nearly the assets and the community you have.
Okay, so we'll do that. We'll just keep going. And I don't know that, I'm thinking back to the vision that Barbara mentioned, trading, free agents. Maybe you guys, we'll just count you as part of the family now, and you'll keep helping us. Thank you.